Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. The bell rang twice at 221B Baker Street on a rainy, gloomy morning in early November, suggesting purpose rather than fear. I had just returned from the chemist with Holmes's requested benzoin tincture solution when I noticed him, not at his regular spot beside the hearth, but standing strangely at the window, his silhouette still against the dull grey drizzle outside. "What is it, Holmes?" I inquired, dusting water off my coat. "You're watching the street as though expecting an invasion." He turned, his gaze narrowing behind his steepled fingers. "Watson, a man has passed our window 3 times in the last quarter hour. Each time the pace is slower than before. He's dressed in a dark East European overcoat, damp shoes with new chalk on the soles, and has an envelope in his right breast pocket that's poorly concealed but obviously very important to him." I approached the window, but the stranger had already climbed our steps. "Shall I—" "No need." Holmes was already at the door. Moments later, a guy entered, stooped slightly, not from age but from what appeared to be a permanent dissatisfaction with bearing. His umbrella spilled on the rug, and his thick moustache trembled over a thin mouth. He clutched a bowler in one hand and the envelope, just as Holmes described, in the other. "I beg your pardon," he replied softly, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes made a little sardonic bow. "That distinction is still mine, at least for the present." The man seems puzzled. "Still?" Holmes motioned him to a chair. "Dr. Watson will take your name and I'll take your purpose. You debated with yourself for the better part of 20 minutes before summoning the courage to stand up. The letter you carry was not written by you, yet it has your name, which causes you anguish. Am I correct so far?" The man blinked. "How in God's name elementary?" Holmes replied gently. "But come on, tell us why you are here." The man paused, then sat down, his hand quivering as he held the envelope toward us. "My name is Ezra Greeley. I am the steward of Briarbridge Hall, a country estate in Hertfordshire. This letter addressed to me arrived yesterday in a parcel with no return address. It was postmarked 1 week after the author's death." Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes stayed stationary. Greeley said, "The man who wrote it was my former employer, Mr. Edward Barclay. He died in a fire 2 weeks ago, burned alive in his own study. His remains were recovered, identified, and interred. He's definitely gone. And yet," Holmes murmured, standing up, "he posts letters from beyond the grave." Greeley set the envelope on the table with reverence, as if it would bite. "I haven't opened it," he replied. "I couldn't. It gives me chills. Mr. Barclay had no relatives remaining and no known enemies. The fire was declared accidental. But now this letter, it calls everything into question." Holmes turned the envelope with his fingers. The paper was thick, off-white, and of good quality. The handwriting, elegant but forceful, bore the unmistakable imprint of a man used to command. "No seal," Holmes observed. "And yet, this was not mailed casually." "Did you say it arrived yesterday?" "Yes, our postman, Mr. Haslam, delivered it in the morning. I asked him twice if he could recall where it came from. He stated that it was transported from a London sorting office. There is no return, no witness, and yet here it is. Barclay's death," Holmes announced abruptly. "What was the cause precisely?" Greeley cleared his throat. "He was discovered in his study, locked from the inside. The fire consumed the majority of the room. The coroner concluded that he most likely fell asleep and knocked down a lamp." "Tragic but unremarkable." "Unremarkable," Holmes echoed and then turned to me. "Watson, would you be so good as to fetch my Inverness and a fresh notebook? Are we going somewhere?" Holmes grinned slightly. "Indeed. Mr. Greeley, if I'm to believe your old employer is writing posthumously, I must examine the site where he last drew breath." Greeley appeared afraid. "You believe he is alive?" Holmes gave the envelope a little tap. "I believe," he added, "that whoever sent this intended you to believe something. We'll soon find out if it was the truth or a really intricate falsehood." And with that, the case of the letter that arrived after its sender's death began, a mystery that would lead us from the scorched ruins of a country estate to the hidden pages of a dead man's diary. and eventually into the heart of a deception so meticulously crafted that even I, Watson, believed its lie for a time. But I go ahead of myself. The game, as Holmes stated with his coat spinning in the rain, was underway. The rain accompanied us all the way to Hertfordshire, falling in heavy streams on the windows of the hired carriage as we drove south. Holmes said little throughout the drive, his attention riveted on the fuzzy scenery as it passed by. His posture was rigid and still, indicating that his mind was working furiously beneath the surface. For my part, I was mulling about Mr. Greeley's narrative and the weird letter, attempting and failing to come up with a logical explanation. The dates themselves defied logic. How could a man send a letter a full week after his death was confirmed and buried? Either someone was imitating Edward Berkeley, or even more crazily, the fire had not taken the man at all. Holmes appeared to foresee my line of thought. "You are wondering, Watson, whether the dead can write letters," he remarked abruptly. I looked up from my notebook. "You must admit, Holmes, it's not a possibility one encounters in the average criminal case, nor is it one I am prepared to entertain," he said sternly. "But incorrect assumptions, no matter how eloquently conveyed, are frequently the foundation of the most sophisticated deceptions. Someone wants Mr. Greeley, and by extension the entire world, to believe Berkeley died in the fire. What we must ask is, who benefits from that belief? Perhaps someone in line to inherit?" "Perhaps," Holmes muttered. "Or perhaps it was Berkeley himself who arranged to vanish. But to what end? That, Watson, is precisely what we are about to determine." The carriage approached a tall iron gate, now bent and half unhinged. Beyond it, the remnants of Briarbridge Hall rose out of the sodden terrain like a wounded beast, its stone walls blackened and stained with soot, and one corner of the manor completely destroyed. The fire had preserved only a part of the east wing, and even that appeared frail and burned. Mr. Greeley greeted us just inside the gate, dressed in a heavy coat and carrying a lantern, despite the fact that it was still early. His face brightened up with relief as we neared. "I didn't think you'd come so soon," he remarked, opening the gate for us. "When there is a corpse that may not be a corpse," Holmes went on to explain, "speed becomes something of a professional necessity." We followed Greeley through the tangled path toward the crumbling hall. As we approached the main door, the stench of burned lumber and moist ash lingered in the air. Despite the rain, the place remained a sense of unnatural calm, as though everything had not only burnt but been silenced. "I have kept the study locked, per the coroner's request," Greeley explained as he led us down the dim corridor, "but you'll find it just as it was after the investigation concluded. The remainder of the housekeeping staff has been terminated." Holmes stood outside the charred study door, removing soot from its frame. "And the body? It was identified conclusively?" "Yes," Greeley replied. "What was left of it? The coroner utilized Berkeley's signet ring and some bone structure. The room was shut from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry," Holmes grunted. "Then we shall see whether the room agrees with that verdict." Greeley unlocked the door with a creaking sound. The air within was heavy and humid, with the foul aroma of charred fabric and roasted wood. The study, or what left of it, was in ruins. The ceiling above had partially fallen, enabling soot-blackened beams to dangle low like the ribs of a skeletal beast. A fireplace yawned ominously at one end, unaffected by the flames. But almost everything else had been consumed, the desk a burned husk, the carpet a charcoal stain. Holmes stepped inside and stood quite still. "Do not speak," he murmured quietly, raising one gloved hand. "Let the room speak first." I watched in silence as he strolled slowly through the room, his gaze shifting from wall to floor to ceiling. He squatted by the desk, ran his hand beneath its damaged frame, and then proceeded toward the hearth, peered up the chimney and brushing his fingertips across the soot-blackened stones. After several minutes, he spoke again. "Watson is here. Take note of the soot track along the skirting board, directly below the window." I bent down. Sure enough, a thin line of grey soot ran along to the wall before abruptly stopping at a square mark in the dust, indicating that something had certainly rested there, sheltering the surface from the smoke. A trunk, I wondered. Likely. A trunk that was removed after the fire started. But how? The room was sealed. Holmes offered a faint smile. "Precisely. But the soot tells us otherwise. The trail is too consistent. Something was removed after the flames had already risen." He turned back to Greeley. "Tell me, Was there anything missing from this room that you did not report to the authorities? The steward appeared worried. Missing? No, I mean, it's difficult to say what was here before the fire. However, a strong box was maintained beneath the floorboards under the desk. Mr. Barclay stored his personal papers there. I realized it had disappeared, but I assumed the fire... Fire does not remove iron boxes, Holmes stated crisply. Someone took it. He circled the fireplace once again before reaching into the shadows beneath the grate and extracting something with a gloved hand. A piece of burnt cloth, or so it appeared. But as he turned it over, I noticed that it was a burnt glove made of exquisite leather that had turned black and brittle. Holmes investigated the interior lining. Too small for Barclay, he remarked. This glove belonged to a woman. Greeley stiffened. A woman. However, there were no ladies in the house at the time. Holmes looked up, eyes sparkling. Then we must examine the possibility that one has visited, undetected and unaccounted for. Tell me, Mr. Greeley, who last saw Mr. Barclay alive? The steward hesitated. It was me, I suppose. He dined alone that evening. At 7:15, I handed him his supper. After that, he sent me out with instructions not to disturb him. When I returned at 10, the corridor was already filled with smoke. I tried the door, but it was locked from the inside. Holmes nodded. And no other visitors? There were none that I knew of. The gates were locked for the night, as they always are. Holmes stood in the center of the room thinking. This was not an accident. There's too much accuracy here. The fire was intentionally planned to coincide with Barclay's disappearance, as evidenced by the soot, missing box and glove. They achieved it with access to the interior of a sealed room. He turned rapidly towards the door. Watson, we need to talk with the postman. I'd like to know exactly where the letter entered the postal system, and if it was posted before or after the fire. And what do you expect to find? I inquired as we departed the study. Holmes cast a single glance back at the burned ruin. Either a man rose from the dead to write it, or someone went to tremendous lengths to make it seem so. The solution, I believe, is not in the ashes, but in the timing. As we went out into the fading daylight, a gust of wind blew a few dead leaves across the scorched threshold behind us, like whispers from a fire that had said its last yet still had more to say. And somewhere not far from that silence, the truth was hiding, veiled in smoke, timing, and lies. We left Briarbridge Hall in silence, the bleak, charred estate receding behind us as the carriage rolled down the gravel path. Holmes remained stuck in meditation, chin in hand, his gaze fixated on some distant spot beyond the grey, hedge-lined fields. I refrained from interrupting. Experience had taught me that in those still moments, when Holmes remained silent for extended periods of time, the strands of mystery knitted themselves into patterns only he could see. Finally, he stirred. The fire isn't the mystery, Watson. The story is being told through it. How do you mean? Every element at Briarbridge was a deliberate symbol. The locked door, the destroyed papers, the single witness to Barclay's solitude, and then, posthumously, a letter. He looked at me. What kind of man writes a letter to his steward and arranges for it to arrive after the world believes him dead? Or what kind of impostor, I said. Exactly, Holmes responded. We do not yet know the truth. We only have an illusion, and that illusion is entirely dependent on timing. We must understand when the letter actually entered the postal system. If the postmark is proven to be a forgery, or the chain of handling is tampered with, we may see the end of this scheme. By late afternoon, we had arrived in the nearby village of Marlow-on-Layer, a small hamlet of stone cottages and sloping lanes, with the local post office nestled between a cobbler's shop and a weathered chapel. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old paper. Behind the narrow wooden counter, a man stood there with a grey beard and spectacles that magnified his eyes to the point where they looked like watch crystals. "This is Mr. Haslam?" Holmes asked. The man gave a polite nod. "I am. May I help you, gentlemen?" Holmes flashed his card. "Sherlock Holmes. This is my associate, Dr. Watson. We are making inquiries about a letter delivered yesterday to Mr. Ezra Greeley of Briarbridge Hall. You handled it personally, I believe." Mr. Haslam's brow furrowed as he searched memory. Yes, I did. It was part of the morning delivery. Large ivory envelope, no return. Addressed by hand. Do you recall its origin?" "I do, sir." "That's what made it stand out. It passed through the London Central Sorting Office, Stamped at 9:47 p.m. 3 days ago. Holmes's voice sharpened. 3 days ago? Yes, sir. Not yesterday, not the day before, but 3 days back. It had an ordinary second-class stamp, no express mark. Holmes nodded slowly. And is it possible, he asked, for a letter to be backdated in that office? For example, could someone manipulate the postmark to appear as if it had passed through at a particular time? Haslam's face grew firm. In London Central? Not likely. That system's strictly managed. The stamp is applied by machine, no human hand involved once it enters the bin. Holmes drummed his fingers on the counter. And this envelope, did it bear any signs of tampering? A double seal, perhaps, or a fresh adhesive overrolled? Haslam shook his head. No, sir. Looked clean. Opened and closed in one motion. No tricks to it, if you ask me. Holmes gave a small nod. Thank you, Mr. Haslam. One last thing, would you happen to have the delivery record for that day? The postmaster stepped into the back room and returned moments later with a thin booklet. Here we are, he said, pointing. Mr. Greeley. One envelope recorded and signed for at 8:02 a.m. the morning before last. Holmes examined the page, then closed the book gently. You've been most helpful. Outside, the wind had picked up and the light was beginning to fade behind the hills. Holmes walked briskly toward the inn where we had secured lodging, his coat flapping like a shadow in motion. I followed close behind. Well, I asked once we were inside and alone. Holmes poured a modest measure of brandy from the decanter on the sideboard and passed it to me. The letter is genuine, at least in terms of postal procedure. It entered the London Central system 3 days ago. That in and of itself is not damning, but it becomes critical when we recall that Edward Berkeley's body was declared recovered and buried 5 days ago. I set my glass down slowly. Then someone else mailed it. Or someone lied about the date of death, Holmes said. But consider this. If the letter was posted after Berkeley's death, then one of two things must be true. Either Berkeley was not the one who died in that fire, or someone else had access to his private correspondence and intended to use it for a purpose. I leaned forward. You believe someone else died in his place? I believe, said Holmes, that the only thing we can trust is what we can prove. That room was a tableau. The missing strongbox, the woman's glove, the sealed door. It was meant to suggest a closed fate. But the soot trail tells a different tale. Someone moved freely within that room during or after the fire, and that someone removed something of value. What do you think was in the strongbox? Papers, Holmes said immediately. Correspondence, perhaps. Legal documentation. Something worth concealing or retrieving before the fire destroyed the evidence. There was a long pause before I spoke again. And what about the woman? Holmes gave a tight smile. Ah, yes, the glove. He drew it from his coat pocket and turned it over once more. Left-handed. Fine leather imported. A Parisian make sold only in select shops. Stitched initials, AD, rather clumsily picked out on the inner lining. Do you know her? Not yet, but I suspect we shall. Holmes moved to the table where I had left my notes. With a piece of chalk, he began to diagram something on the bare surface. A sequence of lines and circles representing the house, the study, the soot trail, the chimney, and the removed trunk. We have the scene, he murmured, tapping the center. We have the illusion. But what we lack is the motive. Why would Edward Berkeley stage his own death, if indeed he did? And if someone else burned in that fire, who was it? What identity did they hold? Whom did they leave behind? He stepped back from the table and paced slowly. Tomorrow morning, Watson, we must visit the solicitor who managed Berkeley's affairs. We need to know what, if anything, he stood to gain by dying. And if the solicitor is in on it, then we shall be very polite and very suspicious. We rose early the next morning and made our way to the chambers of Redgrave and Sons, solicitors, located in a narrow Georgian terrace near the Marlow Market. The office, lined with heavy books and the smell of old parchment, was presided over by a thin, bird-like man named Percival Redgrave. Yes, I handled Mr. Berkeley's estate, he said, steepling his fingers. A curious matter, certainly. His will was updated scarcely 2 weeks before his death. 2 weeks? Holmes asked. That's unusually close, indeed, Redgrave agreed. He summoned me rather urgently, made several amendments, then sent me away with explicit instructions not to discuss the contents with anyone until after his death. Holmes leaned forwards. "And what were those amendments?" Redgrave hesitated. "I'm not certain I ought to share them." Holmes reached into his coat and produced the charred glove. "This was found beneath Mr. Barclay's hearth. Do you know of any female relatives who might be connected to him? Perhaps one with the initials A.D. Redgrave's face went pale. "My word," he whispered. "Miss Alicia Duval. His niece, or more accurately, his late niece. She died abroad. France, I believe, years ago." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet her glove lies beneath his grate." Redgrave stood, now visibly rattled. I believe I may have erred. I shall retrieve the updated will." He disappeared into the rear office, and Holmes turned to me. "Alicia Duval," he said softly. "A woman presumed dead, a glove in a dead man's hearth, and a fire that tells a lie. We are not unraveling one death, Watson. We are chasing ghosts made of smoke and motive." Moments later, Redgrave returned with a thin folder. He laid it before Holmes. The final page, signed in a careful hand, bore one stunning clause, and in the event of my death, I name as sole beneficiary Miss Alicia Duval. Should she be living? Holmes's smile was as piercing as shattered glass. "So," he whispered, "the dead man leaves everything to a woman presumed lost. And she might have helped him disappear." And all of a sudden, the fire, the glove and the letter felt like a shadow cast by someone standing just out of sight. Holmes stared over the will's final clause, his eyes narrowing as if the writing itself may reveal a hidden confession. I stood behind him, rereading the passage that shifted our inquiry. Miss Alicia Duval. Should she be living? It was an unusual statement, not only designating her as successor, but also explicitly implying her survival. A prospect that, according to Redgrave's previous recollection, had been ruled out years before. Holmes returned the document to the solicitor, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Redgrave," he began, "you referenced Miss Duval's probable death. May I ask how her death was determined?" Redgrave cleared his throat, visibly agitated. "It was approximately 5 years ago. She was going in southern France, Nice if I recall, when a tiny pleasure yacht foundered near the Côte d'Azur. Several passengers drowned, including a young Englishwoman named A. Duval. A family acquaintance informed Barclay of the news. Her body, however, was never found. The French authorities issued a death certificate in absentia." Holmes turned sharply. "No body has yet been certified dead. Watson, aren't you curious?" I nodded slowly. "Convenient, one might say." Redgrave bristled. "It was okay at the time. The circumstances were terrible, yet no one suspected anything wrong." "No one," Holmes repeated. "Except Edward Barclay. His will implies that he had a different opinion. I believe he knew Alicia was alive and expected her to return." Redgrave looked baffled. "But why go to these lengths?" "Fire, body, and deception." Holmes's fingers tightened as he began to pace the chamber. "Because, my dear sir, Barclay was not preparing an inheritance, he was planning an escape. And the only person he trusted with that plan was the woman whom the world already thought was dead." The weight of that implication settled in the air, resulting in silence. I spoke hesitantly. "Then you believe they worked together?" Holmes stopped pacing. "I think she was involved, definitely. The missing strongbox. The glove is beneath the hearth. The amended will names her as the sole beneficiary. All indications imply that Alicia Duval was not only alive, but also present at Briarbridge Hall on the night of the fire. Despite this, she has not taken any steps forward since. Why?" "Because," I explained slowly, "if she appeared now, questions would be asked." Holmes grinned thinly. "Exactly so. Better to be a ghost and receive her fortune from behind a veil." Redgrave took off his spectacles and scratched his brow. "This is extraordinary. What will you do now?" "I will find Miss Duval," Holmes stated simply. "And I believe I know precisely where to begin looking." We returned to our lodgings briefly to prepare for our trip. Holmes instructed that I notify Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard, asking him to postpone any official inquest or action at Briarbridge until further notice. Then, with only a little valise and Holmes's ever-present walking stick, we took the early evening train to London. The cubicle was dim and private, and Holmes stayed unusually quiet for most of the voyage. I could see him narrowing his focus, removing the supposition and smoke to reveal simply the skeleton of the truth beneath. He spoke at last when the city's outside lamps flickered past the window. "Watson, what do you know of boarding houses near Belgrave Square?" "Not much," I confessed. "Why?" "Because Alicia Duval, or someone calling herself that, was spotted near one of them 2 days before the fire." I sat forward. "Spotted? By whom?" "An old acquaintance from the Diogenes Club. One of Mycroft's informants is a clerk with an excellent recall. He noticed her enter a lodging place on Queen's Row, carrying a trunk labelled with foreign names. She signed the register with the name Anne Duval, spelled with an E but phonetically identical. The clerk thought little of it at the moment, until he learned Berkeley had perished. He mentioned it to Mycroft, who relayed it to me. I was astounded. "And you didn't mention this before?" Holmes shrugged. "Timing, Watson. Before we went ghost hunting, I wanted to make sure our evidence was solid. We now know she had a purpose, an opportunity, and was in the country many days before her uncle's reported death. It's time to call on Queen's Row." By the time we got in Belgravia, night had fallen and the streets were damp from recent rain. Queen's Row was a tortuous little alley, wedged between a tailor's store and a gentleman's club. The building stately but worn, the kind of location where transitory inhabitants might drift in and out without raising problems. Holmes came to a halt in front of a modest 4-story house with a tarnished metal number plate. He knocked, and after a little period the door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with silver hair fastened beneath a cap. "Yes?" Holmes smiled warmly but nonchalantly. "Good evening, madame. We're seeking to inquire about a past lodger. Miss Duval. French or Belgian, perhaps?" I arrived with a travel trunk. The landlady furrowed her brow. "That one? Came and gone soon. Pretty, yet anxious. Checked out 2 mornings ago. Did she leave a forwarding address?" "No, she said she would send someone for her trunk. But no one has arrived yet." Holmes looked at me and then back at her. "Might we see the trunk?" She paused. "Suppose there is no danger. Still in the back room. However, it is a bit moist down there. Be mindful of your shoes." She took us down a cellar staircase, where the floorboards creaked and the air smelt like coal and mildew. In the far corner, next to a stack of firewood, stood a modest trunk, battered and scuffed with 3 faded labels, Nice, Calais and Dover. Holmes knelt and examined the clasp. It wasn't locked. With the landlady's nod, he lifted the lid. Inside, carefully folded, were numerous pieces of women's clothes, French in design, pale and simple. Under them was a leather folio, a little velvet purse and a half-burned page taken from a ledger. Holmes removed and opened the folio. Inside there were dozens of papers, legal deeds, correspondence and financial records, all bearing the unmistakable signature of Edward Berkeley. "Well, Watson," he mumbled, "here lies the heart of it." He then lifted the pouch, untying the drawstring to reveal a pair of gold cufflinks engraved with the Berkeley family crest, and a signet ring identical to the one Greeley claimed was used to identify the body. My breath caught. "That was the ring buried with Berkeley." "Was a duplicate," Holmes concluded. "And this is the original." The landlady glanced uncomfortably between us. Is she in trouble?" "Only if she returns too soon," Holmes replied dryly. He gave her a sovereign. "Please say nothing about our visit. If someone arrives for the trunk, inform Scotland Yard right away." She nodded, her eyes wide. Outside, the fog thickened once more. Holmes lit a cigarette as we returned to the station. "She staged it all," I stated calmly. "Faked his death, retrieved the documents, and vanished." Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, he staged it. She merely helped him vanish. But something went wrong. She vanished without receiving the inheritance. You think she ran?" "I suspect," Holmes continued, exhaling slowly, "Alicia Duval meant to disappear with Edward Berkeley. But someone else might have had a different plan. And for the first time in this strange case, I noticed something unusual flicker across Holmes's face. Doubt Holmes walked slowly through the fog that had settled like a theatre curtain over the streets of Belgravia, his face tight with contemplation, his boots tapping against the slippery paving stones. I walked in silence, the image of the unclaimed trunk and its hidden treasures still fresh in my mind, the original signet ring, the financial paperwork, and the half-charred ledger sheet. It had all the signs of a rushed departure, or worse, an interrupted plan. We had almost reached the corner of Ebury Street when Holmes paused, his gaze drawn to the ironwork balcony of the lodging house across the square. A silhouette stood still for just a second too long. Then it disappeared into the shadows. Holmes did not say anything, but his hand grabbed my sleeve and pushed me into the opening of an alleyway, where we stood in complete darkness, the illumination of the gas lamps touching only the fringe of his coat. She was watching, he explained gently. Not the landlady, her Alicia, or a person posing as her. She's never left the city, Watson. She's hiding in plain sight, circling the debris and waiting for the best time to act. But something has gone awry in her small theatre. What makes you so certain? Holmes gestured back toward the lodging house. Why quit the ring? Why leave the ledger, letters, and documentation of the plan? That trunk was supposed to follow her, but it hasn't moved. It's as if she vanished during the height of her own performance. I frowned. Then we must ask not only what happened to her, but who else knew she was here. Holmes nodded once and quickly led the way back to the main road, where he grabbed a taxi with a piercing whistle. We stepped on, and Holmes gave us the address of a small gentleman's club off Cavendish Square, a place I'd never heard of, despite Holmes whispering its name. Whitewood House, he told me as we drove along. Discreet and well-connected. I suppose we'll locate someone who recalls Alicia, or at least the person who is trailing her. The club was subtle, with dark green walls and an entrance covered by twin columns. Inside, the air was quiet and old, with the aroma of pipe smoke blending with cologne and pen. Our steward brought us to a curtained drawing room, where Holmes was immediately recognized and waved through without hesitation. A man in his late 40s sat near the fire, giving the impression that he watches more than he speaks. His clothes were immaculate, his attitude neutral, but his eyes, unlike Holmes, missed nothing. Mr. Fielding, Holmes acknowledged with a modest nod. You will excuse the interruption. I need information and I don't have much time. The man nodded. I was warned that you might call. Mycroft warned me. Holmes gave a wry smile. He is always 2 steps ahead. Then maybe you already know what I'm going to ask. Fielding considered a moment. You're here about Alicia Duval. Watson and I exchanged eyes. You saw her? Holmes asked. Fielding tapped the side of his nose. We don't speak too clearly in here, but certainly. A woman who matches her description came 10 days ago. She registered herself under a French variant. She was cautious but not meticulous enough. She was being watched. Holmes's gaze narrowed. By whom? Fielding paused. He went by the name Mr. Kincross. Tall and angular, he always wore gloves. He spoke with a northern accent, which is not native to London. He claimed to be a solicitor, but never carried any cards. He turned up 3 evenings after Miss Duval had arrived. He wasn't watching the trunk. He was watching her. Was there contact between them? There are none here. However, she stopped coming after the 5th day. She checked out of her temporary room across the street and has not been seen since. Holmes leaned forwards. And this Mr. Kincross, still in town. Lodging on Gloucester Place. Keeps strange hours. I could see Holmes's mind churning behind his calm expression. She didn't run, he answered finally. She was intercepted. We left Whitewood House shortly after 10 a.m., and within half an hour, we were standing in the rain-slicked shadows across from number 43 Gloucester Place, a property that appeared decent, but had, in Holmes's words, a whiff of something rented to discretion rather than taste. No light streamed from the top windows, yet a glimmer of movement inside the entryway piqued our interest. A tall man in a dark coat emerged outside, umbrella in hand, and moved briskly toward the street. Holmes nudged me. That's him. Take my lead. We stayed on the other pavement, following him east through the drizzle, until he turned down a quieter side street and into a small tobacconist's shop. Holmes pulled me near. We'll approach him, but gently. I want information, not alarm. Inside, the shop was cramped and filled with smoke. The tall man stood at the counter, paying for a tin of pipe tobacco. As we entered, he turned, and our gazes met for a brief instant. He was younger than expected, maybe 35, with an angular face and thin, pale lips. His gloves, however, stood out the most to me. Fine leather, tight-fitting, worn indoors. Holmes approached with an almost friendly demeanor. Good evening. Mr. Kincross, I presume. The man's eyes sparkled, but he did not respond. Holmes proceeded. I represent a client whose affairs appear to overlap with a woman you've just watched, Alicia Duval. Or Anne Duval, if you prefer that alias. There's still silence. Kincross simply placed his change in his pocket and turned to leave. Holmes's voice became sharper. Are you was sighted around Queen's Row? You followed her, and now she has vanished. If you know where she is, speak up right now, or Scotland Yard will be much less patient. Cairncross halted at the entrance before turning slowly. You don't know what you're involved in. Mr. Holmes, I know that a woman has vanished, a man presumed dead may not be, and the only thread that binds them is you. Cairncross studied Holmes for a long time before speaking quietly. You are asking questions that will jeopardize more than reputations. Barclay was not a victim, nor was Alicia Duval. They were smugglers of secrets, and I was dispatched to ensure that what they knew remained dead. Holmes inclined his head. Sent by whom? Cairncross offered a frigid smile. Let's just say there are men in this city who know better than to let ghosts speak. He stepped by us without waiting for a response. Disappearing into the downpour, Holmes did not follow. Instead, he stood motionless, breathing shallowly, his expression unreadable. I interrupted the silence. Do you believe him? Holmes sighed and then turned. No, or rather not all of it. He knows more than he's admitted, and less than he claims. But now I feel Alicia is alive and in danger. Whatever their plan was, it could not be kept to themselves. That night we returned to Baker Street through a fresh fog. Holmes was mute throughout the ride, lost in a private storm. When we arrived, he did something unusual. He unsealed the sealed packet that Greeley had delivered days before. Inside, only 3 lines were written in a delicate, precise hand. Ezra, delete the papers if I do not return by the 17th. Do not trust anyone, even those who use my name. E.B., when was the letter postmarked? The 18th. Holmes set the paper down with the delicacy of someone holding a confession that was too late to be heard. They were betrayed, he explained sadly. The question now, Watson, is by whom? Holmes stayed sitting long after the fire had died down to a dull red glow, the opened letter lying on the edge of the mantelpiece, like the final piece in a puzzle that refused to finish itself. I observed him from my chair, the familiar scent of damp London air wafting in through the cracked window behind us, mixed with the slight aroma of tobacco and soot. It had been more than an hour since Cairncross vanished into the mist, and Holmes had not moved from that gloomy quiet, which I had grown to know as the coiling of a spring rather than idleness. Finally, he rose. Barclay gave Greeley instructions to destroy the papers if he failed to return by the 17th, he said quietly. And yet the letter was mailed on the 18th. That means he trailed off, that someone else posted it, I explained. Holmes nodded, and wanted it to look like Barclay had done so. But there's an inconsistency. Why warn Greeley about others who speak with his name after the moment of no return? It's overly meticulous, too curated. Barclay was trying to leave a legacy of paranoia, or someone wanted it to look that way. Holmes uttered a contented hum. Yes, Watson, you're hearing an echo. A voice is left behind to conceal the final act. But the genuine event occurred in the unrecorded space between the 16th and the 18th, the silence in which Alicia vanished and Barclay's legacy was rewritten. I stood and proceeded to the desk, where the paperwork from the trunk were neatly stacked. We combed through these, Holmes. Land deeds, communications, and receipts. Nothing indicates betrayal. Not yet, he replied. However, we were looking for proof of flight. What if we misread the objective of these papers? What if they are not only records but bait? I looked up. Bait for whom? For the person Barclay feared most. He began sorting through the folio again, painstakingly, until he came to a page I hadn't noticed before. A ledger from a shipping company, faintly charred on one edge. He lay it flat. See this? He asked, pointing. Freight registered under the alias Edward Dawson, bound from Calais to Harwich. The manifest contains a container labeled Antique Engineering Gear. A common enough cover, I said. Common enough to be invisible, Holmes answered. However, the date of departure was the 16th. The day Barclay was last seen alive, I leaned in. Are you suggesting Barclay did escape? I'm suggesting he tried, Holmes answered coldly. But whether he succeeded, that remains the question. He returned to his letter. If Barclay meant to flee using the Dawson alias, the warning to Greeley makes sense only if he feared betrayal shortly before leaving. But why send the letter at all, unless— He stopped, brow wrinkled. Yes? Unless it was intercepted and dispatched purposefully after his death to shift attention elsewhere. To cast doubt in all directions. Holmes started to pace. Kincross is too refined to be just an enforcer. He claims Barclay and Alicia smuggled secrets. What kinds of secrets? Financial? Political? No, this isn't about currency. It's about leverage. Someone powerful wanted them gone, but they couldn't leave unless specific documents were returned. He came to a quick stop and turned to face me. Watson, we must visit Greeley again, tonight. When we returned to Briarbridge Hall, it was long past midnight. The air was cooler, and a hard wind had risen, scraping against the burnt-out stone as if the structure itself was still whispering warnings. Greeley greeted us at the servants' gate, holding a candle and looking anxious. I didn't expect— No time for apologies, Holmes interrupted. We need access to Mr. Barclay's personal study again, and immediately. Was anything relocated since our last visit? Greeley shakes his head. Nothing. I have kept it locked. Good. Then you leave. Holmes slipped by him and we continued down the same burned hallway as previously. The scent of damp ash still lingered on the scorched walls. Holmes lit a lamp and returned to the hearth, kneeling beside the stones once more. The glove was retrieved from here, he murmured half to himself. But look, see the soot patterns. I moved closer. A new grey stripe stretched from the edge of the fireplace to a bent floorboard. That wasn't there before, Holmes stated plainly. He took a blade from his pocket and pried up the board. Hidden beneath the crawl area was a narrow wooden box, smoke-blackened and sealed with a crude wax stamp. Greeley gasped. I've never seen that before. Which is precisely the point, Holmes said quietly. He shattered the wax. Inside were 3 items: a folded sheet of thick parchment, a black notebook covered in cracked leather, and a photograph. Holmes opened the parchment first. His gaze glanced it swiftly before narrowing. It's a confession, he explained, or a fragment of one. The slant indicates that it was written in Barclay's hand. He read aloud. If this reaches you, it means I failed to escape the web. Alicia may still be safe. She must hide. The names in the book will keep her safe, but only if the others believe I burned with the falsehoods. Kincross is not as he appears. If he discovers this, everything will unravel. Ezra, burn it if you must. Remember, not every opponent wears a mask. The room went silent. I went to the box and lifted the photograph. It was of Alicia, younger by a few years, but unmistakable. She stood next to another man. Tall and sharp-featured, Kincross. Holmes cautiously opened the leather notebook to a page that had been marked. Names. There are plenty of them. Government guys. Foreign agents, journalists, businessmen. All are linked to transactions, signatures, and payments. It's a list of favors, including obligations and leverage. Their black book. He looked up. This is what Kincross wanted buried. I felt a shiver not from the wind, but from Holmes's serene confidence. He wasn't chasing Alicia because she knew something, Holmes explained softly. He was chasing her because she had something. The photograph flew in my hands, and if she still does— Holmes did not respond at first. He then met my gaze. Then she is already as good as dead, unless we find her first. Outside, the wind howled low through Briarbridge's ruins, a long, painful sound reminiscent of something forgotten. And I realized then that this case had gone beyond the realm of conventional crime. It had entered the sphere of power. The wind outside howled like a restless conscience as Holmes closed the notebook and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. Greeley stood motionless against the blackened doorframe, his candle flickering, his face pale in the dim light. Even I, used to the harsh revelations of Holmes's work, felt the sting of anxiety creeping between my ribs. This was no longer an issue of inheritance or deception. It had evolved into something darker, a conflict between those wielding power in public and those dealing in secrets behind closed doors. Holmes turned to Greeley. Has anyone been here at Briarbridge since our last visit? Anyone unannounced? No, Greeley replied quickly, then paused. At least, I assumed not. But yesterday morning, I discovered muddy tracks near the back of the property. I imagined they belonged to a groundsman. Holmes approached him, suddenly attentive. What time? Just before dawn. Holmes looked up at the shattered glass over the fireplace. Rain dripped steadily through a fractured pane. Somebody came looking for this package. When they couldn't find it, they left. He turned to face me. We aren't ahead of them, Watson. We are parallel. We must increase the distance. We returned to London at dawn, a bleak, damp sky pushing down on the rooftops, as if attempting to bury the city beneath its weight. I don't recall Holmes speaking at all during the voyage, including to himself. He clutched the notebook tightly in one hand, silently thumbing its pages, as if the names inside whispered clues too delicate to say aloud. When we arrived at Baker Street, he placed it on the table between us and carefully opened it again. I leaned in, watching him group the names and mutter almost imperceptibly as he made notes with a pencil on the back of an envelope. "This," he said at last, tapping a column, "is the pattern. Take note of the repetition. Various names appear next to dates, followed by symbols, usually sums, some fairly huge, some oddly small. Now look here." He flipped the pages. "These names are associated with Her Majesty's Treasury, certain foreign offices, and here, 3 correspond with a failed railway deal between France and Prussia in 1989. This notebook is not only a ledger, it's a map of political leverage. Berkeley had likely been collecting favors for decades." I sat back. "And now Alicia holds it." Holmes did not look up. "If she's still alive." There was a prolonged hush. I had started to say something when the bell rang, not hesitantly but with a quick, nervous double press. Mrs. Hudson introduced a youngster no older than 12, drenched to the bone and holding a folded paper. "Man gave this to me," he said breathlessly, "and said it was for Mr. Holmes. Said I should run if I wanted to keep the tip." Holmes took a page and unfolded it. The writing was hasty and inconsistent, but obviously feminine. The message was brief. "I did not betray him. Meet me where the glass birds watch. After dusk." I can't remain long. A. Holmes looked at the note for a time. "She's alive," I frowned. "The glass birds." He was already moving. She could only be referring to one site in London. The aviary in Holland Park is an old glass conservatory with mounted taxidermy displays. I recall it from a case in 1995. The edifice remains, although it is no longer open to the public. I rose. "It could be a trap." "It's a trap," Holmes remarked, seeming satisfied. "But the question is whose?" We arrived in Kensington well before sunset and stayed on the park's perimeter until the long shadows of the trees blended together and the gaslights began to sputter in the mist. Holmes led us to the iron gate at the border of the old conservatory, which was a glass-panelled dome mottled with moss and stained with dust, with its door half-chained but unlocked. Inside, the air was moist and rust-tinged. Rows of empty iron perches looked like the skeletons of forgotten beasts, and in the far corner, beneath a rusting sign that read "Birds of the World," a lone figure sat. She was tall and veiled, with her head lowered. When we came into view, she turned, and there she was, Alicia Duval. She appeared thinner than in the photograph, with hollow cheeks and a weary posture. Her eyes, a delicate grey-green, blazed with desperate insight. "I wasn't followed," she replied immediately. I made certain. Holmes made a little bow. "I'm Miss Duval. Or should I say Mrs. Berkeley? You've been impossible to track." She gave him a harsh glance. "That was the idea." Holmes motioned for her to sit on the iron bench. "Time is short. So let's be clear. Berkeley is dead." Alicia hesitated and then nodded. "Yes, he was murdered." I felt something sink in my chest, as I had suspected. Holmes didn't flinch. "When?" "On the 16th. The night he was supposed to leave. We got everything ready. The passage was booked, the papers were faked, and the package was shipped ahead. He travelled to the estate to fetch the ledger. I was supposed to meet him in the safe house in Dover. He never came." Her voice wavered. "I waited for one day, then another. Then I received a parcel with no sender. Inside was a note in Berkeley's handwriting, and his watch broken, burnt." Holmes leaned in. "And you believe Kincross is responsible?" "I know he is. He was supposed to be one of us and mediator. Berkeley trusted him, but he wanted the book. He must have discovered our preparations, murdered Edward, and attempted to conceal the whole thing as a disappearance." Holmes's tone became sharper. "Then why not take the ledger from you directly?" "I hid it," she replied simply. "He came for me 3 nights ago. Said it would be all right if I handed it over. I fled. I left the trunk. Mr. Holmes, I knew you'd discover it. I didn't know who else to trust." "You left the glove as a marker," Holmes explained. "I wanted us to follow the trail." She nodded. Holmes stood. "You must leave London. Tonight. Return to the safe house if it is still safe. Watson and I will deal with Kincross, and whatever remains of Berkeley's ledger." Alicia's eyes blazed. "I'm not running. You must. The men whose names are in that book do not issue second warnings. If we expose them, they will disperse like rats. But if they believe you still have it—" A startling noise interrupted the silence. A footstep. Holmes turned immediately. "Stay behind me," he snarled. A tall, slim, gloved figure appeared at the far edge of the conservatory, Kincross. He stepped forward with an inscrutable expression. "I hoped you'd come," he murmured quietly. Holmes' voice sounded like a drawn sword. "Step no closer." Kincross gazed at Alicia. "You could have walked away." "You got it. You knew what was in it." "I still do," she replied coldly. "And I'd rather burn it than let you sell what Edward died to keep hidden." "Then you're both fools," Kincross muttered. Holmes shifted. "Watson, sir, now." I reached into my coat and pulled out the pistol. At the same time, the conservatory door burst open, revealing Lestrade surrounded by 2 constables. Kincross turned. Too late. "Drop the weapon." Lestrade barked, but nothing was drawn. Kincross raised his hands slowly, his eyes flashing with wrath. "You don't know what you've done." "Oh, I think we do," Holmes responded quietly. Kincross was carried out in handcuffs, silent as stone. In the aftermath, Holmes said very little. The trap had been set the moment we received Alicia's note, and as soon as Holmes was certain she hadn't been intercepted, he wired Lestrade to monitor the rendezvous spot. As we left the conservatory, I asked Holmes a final question. "What will you do with the ledger?" He glanced out into the fog, a grim smile forming at the corners of his mouth. "I will let it murmur. Carefully. Loud enough for the right ear. Quiet enough not to rattle the cage." And we walked on, into a city where truth was frequently hidden by soot and power, but tonight it had found a single ray of sunlight. As we emerged from the conservatory's glass dome, the fog thickened and curled around the lamplight, softening the city's boundaries. Holmes strode in front of me, his coat pressed against the moist air, his posture neither triumphant nor strained, but sad, deeply so. It wasn't the stride I'd grown to associate with winning. There was no flourish or dramatic enjoyment in his steps. Lestrade's soldiers had apprehended Kincross without resistance. Alicia had departed silently, promising to disappear again until Holmes could sort the echo from the real. And the ledger, now tucked beneath Holmes's arm within a plain satchel, seemed less like evidence and more like something flammable we were attempting to transport through an open flame. Finally, Holmes spoke. "I should be satisfied, Watson. We stopped a murderer. Saved a woman's life. Recovered the most dangerous little black book in London. You don't sound pleased. I am not. I have just moved the burden of this case from the perpetrators to me." We turned onto a quieter street near Holland Walk. A constable nodded at us from a nearby post and resumed his steady patrol. "The question, Watson," Holmes said, dropping his voice, "isn't whether we won. The question is whether anyone ever genuinely wins when secrets become currency." We arrived at Baker Street just before 3 in the morning. The lamps in the window gleamed dimly. Mrs. Hudson, half awake and half frightened by the hour, offered us tea before shaking her head and leaving. I accepted. Holmes declined. Instead, he sat before the fire and lay the ledger open on his lap. "Listen to this," he continued, without looking up. "June 1888. MT compensated in gold to correct Navy contract faults. Connection the Elon office. Witness was silenced. Ongoing leverage, letter retained by EBMT." I inquired. He tapped the entry with his forefinger. "I'm Michael Tewson. Later, Lord Withrow. Admiralty advisor. Died last year, but not before creating an estate backed by dubious decisions." He flipped the page again. "March 1893, W paid for ignoring foreign telegram intercepts. Intercept sent to FG in Berlin. Recurring access is maintained using JTI felt a cold." "Then Barclay wasn't a blackmailer?" "No," Holmes replied gently. "He was a broker. These aren't ransom notes. They are entries about strategic pressure. Who knew what, who covered what, and how that knowledge was retained. Barclay saved these names not to expose them but to maintain balance. And now we have them all." He eventually looked at me. "Yes, and I can't let them go to the yard." "Not all of them. But surely, Holmes," he raised his hand. "Watson, I have no illusions about the morality of empire. If these names fall all at once, half of Whitehall would collapse in a storm of scandal. Some of the men were careless. Some were corrupt. But a few, I suspect, took decisions in the dark to keep far worse fires from spreading. He closed the ledger. "I'll whisper the names to Lestrade. Others I will deliver to Mycroft for safekeeping, and I'll keep a few to myself in case silence is no longer a virtue." I observed him, unsure which bothered me more, the names in the ledger or the weight I felt descend on Holmes's shoulders now that they were his to protect. "And Alicia?" I inquired. "She'll disappear," he said. "I have arranged for safe transit. She will have no fortune and no name, but she will live if she obeys. And if she doesn't, she dies," Holmes stated simply. I set down my teacup. "You speak of all this with such detachment." Holmes turned towards the fire. "I can't afford sentiment, Watson. Not with these types of games." He remained quiet for a while after that. The flames danced across his face, flickering with ash and exhaustion. I found myself staring not at the ledger, but at the man who now bore its weight. A man who was no longer looking for clues, but determining what truth deserved to live. The next morning the city awoke to a steel-colored sky. As carriages with wet wheels passed over stone, the fog began to clear. Holmes, freshly shaved and dressed with his usual precision, sat by the window holding an open envelope. "It's done," he said, sliding a thin stack of pages toward me. "What Lestrade should know. Enough to arrest 4 men and investigate 6 more. It's more than enough to keep him occupied. And Mycroft." Holmes held up another envelope, this time sealed with black wax. "This will reach him tonight. He'll understand what's inside and what's implied. Do you trust him with this?" "As much as I trust anyone to keep a snake asleep in a box." He slipped both envelopes into his coat and turned to me. "There's one final detail, Watson. Something I must verify before this case can rest." "Where?" Holmes hesitated. Then, more softly, "Berkeley's grave. We hired a cab to Kensal Green Cemetery, where the morning mist still clung to the statuary like reluctant memory. The groundskeeper, accustomed to inquiries from family or the morbidly curious, led us to the Berkeley family plot without much comment. There, among half-sunken stones and crooked iron fencing, stood a newer marker, Edward Berkeley, 1847-1895, taken by flame, remembered by none in vain. Holmes crouched before the grave, brushing aside a few wet leaves. "There's no truth in that epitaph," he said, "but there may be some in what lies beneath." He turned to the groundskeeper. "Has the coffin ever been disturbed?" The man blinked. "Not since burial. No requests for exhumation. Has anyone visited the grave in the past week?" "Can't say for certain. Maybe a woman 2 or 3 nights ago." "Left nothing behind." Holmes stood, satisfied. "Then the deception holds. No one questioned the burial. No one examined the body. Do you intend to?" Holmes shook his head. "No. What matters is that they believed Berkeley died. That belief made Alicia vulnerable, and it made the ledger valuable. The man in the coffin, as whoever he truly was, died so that Edward Berkeley could vanish. That was the plan. Only the betrayer changed the ending. We returned to Baker Street by early afternoon. Holmes lit a pipe, opened the window and watched the sky for a long while. I stood beside him, notebook in hand. "There's one thing I still don't understand, Holmes. Why did Berkeley involve Greeley at all? Why leave the letter, the instructions, if he knew he might not return?" Holmes didn't smile, but the corners of his mouth twitched faintly. "Because Greeley believed in him. Because he needed one man who would follow his instructions blindly, even from beyond the grave. Every trick depends on someone playing their part honestly. And now?" "Now," Holmes said, "it's no longer a trick. It's history." That night I watched him seal the final pages of the ledger in a steel container, which he slid beneath the floorboards beside the fireplace, a place only he and I knew existed. Then he sat once more in his chair and stared into the fire, his face composed, his eyes distant. "What will become of it all?" I asked. "The truth, Watson," he said softly, "doesn't always want to be found. Sometimes it prefers to be kept, not for power, not for threat, but because no one else should bear it. I wrote that line in my journal that night. I never forgot it. And I never asked about the ledger again. For 3 days after the events at the conservatory, Holmes withdrew from society almost entirely. He remained within the walls of Baker Street, venturing out only in the small hours, returning before dawn, and saying nothing of where he had gone or whom he had seen. During that time he neither summoned me for discussion nor accepted a single visitor, even from Lestrade. And though I knew better than to press him, the silence grew heavy with anticipation, like the tension before a final note in a composition yet unplayed. On the fourth morning, I found Holmes at the table, hunched over a stack of letters, all opened, many of them bearing crests and seals I did not recognize. Some I knew from his past inquiries, bearing the faint scent of foreign embassies or military discretion. But one lying apart from the rest was different. It bore no mark at all. He tapped it with a fingertip as I entered. "This one, Watson. This is the end of it." He pushed it toward me, his expression unreadable. The letter was written in a clean, precise hand. I am not threatening or pleading with the person who now owns the ledger. Only this: I wasn't the only one who kept track. If the book lives, so will others. You have a key. However many doors remain, Mr. Holmes, tread carefully. Maintaining silence can have unintended consequences. A once-lost friend is still watching. I looked up. "No name. There is no comeback. But you know who sent it." "I do," Holmes answered. "And I believe it's genuine." "Alicia?" He nodded. "She has vanished again, as she must, but not without sacrificing her own safety. I believe she copied portions of the ledger before passing it to us. Perhaps they carried names we overlooked. If anything happens to us, she will realize it is important. It was her way of balancing the scales, not with vengeance, but with promise." He stood up, crossed to the window and looked down at Baker Street, where the usual bustle of carriages and footsteps continued, as if the previous week had been a dream. I couldn't help but think about how many quiet, furtive stories pass between strangers on these same footpaths, never to be documented or believed. "Then the matter's closed?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied softly. "It's simply sleeping, and I plan to let it sleep." That day we burned the remaining duplicates. Holmes had made a single abstract of the ledger, encoded in the cipher only he and Mycroft understood, a document so devoid of context that it would seem useless to anyone else. The original ledger, still beneath the hearthstone, remained untouched, but Holmes was not himself. He played no violin. He set aside his monographs. He did not even touch the scrapbooks of crime that usually brought him comfort in quieter hours. He walked more than usual, not in his usual abrupt fits of restless pacing, but with long, slow steps through London's quieter paths, often returning with his cuffs damp and his eyes distant. One evening, nearly a week after the conservatory, I returned from an appointment to find him seated in the drawing-room, dressed in a light suit, with a small envelope on the table before him. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was mine. "You've been into my journal," he smiled faintly. "Only the pages about Berkeley. You are, as ever, a careful chronicler of the facts, but you omit one." I sat opposite him. "Which one?" "The cost," I frowned. "Whose?" He tapped the envelope. "Ours." He opened it then and drew out the photograph we'd recovered from the trunk at Queen's Row, the image of Alicia beside Kincross. It was dog-eared now, the edges frayed slightly from handling. "Do you remember what you said, Watson, when you first saw this?" "That it was a trap." "That we'd been walking through their stage." "Yes." Holmes studied the photograph. "But it was a stage they built not for spectacle, but for escape. Berkeley didn't trust his government. Alicia didn't trust her uncle. And neither trusted the world to protect them. They built a lie and climbed inside it, together." He set the photograph down. "And it nearly worked." "You envy them," I said, surprised at the sound of it. Holmes turned to me, not with denial, but something deeper, almost regret. "I understand them," he said, "and that is perhaps worse." He rose and began pacing slowly, his hands folded behind his back. "We spend our lives dragging truth into the open, scraping back the layers of deception. But what happens when deception is the only way to survive? When truth would do more harm than silence?" He turned toward me. "Was it justice, Watson, that we found, or simply a trade?" I looked down at my hands, unsure how to answer. Holmes did not wait for one. "That is the question I cannot write an answer for, because I fear the answer depends on who lives long enough to tell it." Later that night, I found him asleep in the chair. The fire burned low, and the photograph of Alicia and Berkeley rested beside him, curled slightly in the heat. He did not stir when I covered him with the wool blanket. He did not wake when I put the envelope away. I left him there, as I often had before, alone in thought, alone in victory, alone in the weight of what he knew and what he could never speak aloud. And I realized then that this case had changed something in him. It had not made him doubt justice. It had simply taught him that justice, like truth, was sometimes a quiet thing, hidden, buried, not always triumphant, but no less real for being unsaid. And so it was that the case of the letter that arrived after his death concluded not with a trial or a headline, but with silence, a silence guarded by the man who knew more than he could ever reveal and who, perhaps for the first time in his career, chose not to solve the world, but to protect it. It was the rain that woke Holmes the next morning, not the sound of it on the panes, which had long since become background to Baker Street's routine symphony, but the particular smell it carried, that damp, faintly metallic scent that speaks of something turned in the earth. I found him standing at the window with his tea cooling on the sill, still in his dressing gown, his gaze not fixed on the street, but on something far beyond it. He did not look at me when he spoke. She returned to the grave, Watson. It took me a moment to catch up. Alicia? She left a token, Holmes said quietly. A lily. Folded inside the outer petals was a slip of paper. No writing, just an address. I had someone watching. She came just before dawn. I studied his profile. Did your man follow her? She disappeared 2 streets from Kensal Green, he said. Vanished into the traffic as if drawn into the folds of the fog itself. But she wanted me to see the address. That much is clear. And the address? He turned and handed me a small slip, already smoothed flat. It was a number in Whitechapel. A boarding house on Princelet Street, unremarkable by reputation, long forgotten by the city's memory. I knew that stretch well, too well. Most men stayed clear of it after nightfall. And not without reason. She wants you to go, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, and that troubles me. We set out before midday, the rain having turned from a mist to a steady sheet, soaking collars and flattening hats. Holmes walked with a purposeful silence, his stride sharper than it had been in days, as if the damp air had awakened some buried edge in him. He refused a cab. He said he wanted to arrive as no one, to pass unnoticed among the nameless. The house on Princelet was tucked between a laundry and a row of tenements sagging under their own decay. Its paint had peeled down to splinters, and the windows were covered by sooty lace. We climbed 3 narrow flights of stairs, the wood soft beneath our feet. A single bulb burned in the hallway above, casting a yellow sickle of light against the wall. The door was slightly ajar. Holmes reached for the handle and paused. No sound, he murmured. He pushed it open. Inside was a single room, cramped but tidy. A bed, a small stove, a table with an open ledger. Not the ledger, but another, narrower, more recently bound. And beside it on the floor, a pair of gloves. Holmes moved forward like a man into a crypt. He did not touch anything. He merely looked. She was here within the last 24 hours, he said. There's warmth in the stove. The ink on that page is still damp. He stepped to the table and studied the ledger. There were only a few entries, all written in Alicia's hand, lists of names. Some matched the original black book, but others were new. She's tracking them, I said. She's watching the watchers, Holmes replied. He closed the ledger gently, then opened the drawer beneath. Inside lay a small envelope, addressed in faint pencil to Holmes. He opened it. The note inside was brief. Some debts must be kept alive in order to remind the world of their existence. Do not come back. If I have to disappear to maintain equilibrium, I will. If you return, they will follow you. And me, this ledger isn't for justice. It's for remembrance. Let it sleep. A.D. Holmes folded the paper and held it for a moment, as if it could change weight in his hands. She never intended to destroy the book, he said ultimately. Only to rewrite it. For herself. She's become Barclay, I remarked. He nodded. No, not Barclay. Somewhat quieter. Something much more dangerous. Nobody wants to write about the curator of history. I watched Holmes step back to the window. A light fog has begun to creep back across the roofs. He stood there, his gaze scouring the street, but he was not looking for Alicia. He knew she had already left. She warned me not to follow, he explained. I believe her. Not out of fear, but out of respect. We left without touching another object. Holmes locked the door behind him. That night, back on Baker Street, the stillness between us was not uncomfortable. It was simply completed. Holmes had kindled the fire and sat in his chair, a fresh stack of unread newspapers by his side. I took my seat across from him, neither of us needing to explain what was clearly clear. We'd solved the case, but it hadn't ended. It had quietly grown like the roots of a tree growing beneath the city's soil, undetected and uninterrupted, until one day the fractures would emerge. A few days later, I got a letter from Holmes. It was not sealed, not coded, simply folded and delivered in person by a messenger boy with no return address. Watson, there are some realities that only the earth should retain, but it soothes me to know that you, of all men, have heard them said once. If I ever fail to return from one of these silences, you'll know where to look, and more crucially, where not to look. SHI stored the letter in a drawer. I didn't frame it. I did not save it for posterity. Certain things were never intended to be publicized. As a result, I never completed the case of the letter that arrived after his death, at least not in its current form. Only now, long after the names have changed and the echoes have faded, do I allow these last words to emerge. Alicia once wrote, "Some debts must be kept alive," and this was one of those, the concluding chapter of the case of the letter that arrived after his death did not include a final arrest or official confession. It occurred, as so many endings do in Sherlock Holmes's life, as a quiet climax, the gradual settling of truths too deadly for headlines and too powerful for the courts. Weeks passed, and so did the final ripples of the affair. Lestrade, while never having access to the entire ledger, made effective use of what Holmes had given him. 2 high-ranking officials left in quick succession, each citing personal health, leaving rumors of corruption in their wake. Her third man, known for his belligerent statements in Parliament, went to the continent. No formal accusations were filed, and their identities never appeared alongside Barclay's in any public document. Kincross was tried privately for obstruction and conspiring to defraud. The more serious charges, which could have revealed the full stakes of the game, were never presented as evidence. He was sentenced to 6 years at Wormwood Scrubs, but the press, which was ravenous for stories about royalty and war, paid little attention. As Holmes and I started our routine, I couldn't help but notice minor changes in him. He was no less brilliant or incisive, but he appeared distant and sparing in his remarks, as if each new event, including the murders and thefts, felt insignificant in comparison. He seldom mentioned Alicia again. Only once, while studying a French newspaper in quiet, did he tap the page with his forefinger and remark, "She's watching still," before saying nothing further. On a gloomy morning in mid-November, a packet arrived for me, plain brown paper, sealed without wax, and the handwriting was strange. Inside was a little notebook. Not the original ledger, not even a copy. But here's something different, a diary. I recognized Alicia's immediately. Its entries were few, with most being no more than a sentence or two, but each had significance. He says fire will make them believe. I told him I would vanish too, but I never meant it. There are debts and balances. Sometimes they're not the same. The last line attracted my attention. "If you find this, Doctor, you were the only one I trusted not to weaponize what I left behind. Tell him that I decided not to disappear." I decided to remember, because somebody had to. I brought the notebook to Holmes that afternoon. He read it silently and returned it without saying anything. He didn't keep it. Instead, he asked me to return it to its original location, Briarbridge Hall. The ruins remained, but Greeley had boarded them up, and the ivy had started to recover the walls. I buried the diary myself, right beneath the hearth where the first hint had originally been. I didn't note the spot. I didn't need to. When I returned, Holmes was waiting by the fireplace, the flickering light forming long shadows on the ancient carpet. Was she right? I questioned him. To preserve the truth? To continue remembering? He stared at the flame. "Sometimes, Watson," he said, "the truth doesn't set us free. It can be what binds us, to silence, duty, or regret." But yeah, she was correct, because history is only preserved in the hands of those who remember it. He then turned and gave me one of those rare glances that were clear, human, and completely genuine. And so must we, that night. The rain subsided, and a single star appeared above Baker Street. I'm not sure which aspect of the case haunted Holmes the most, the ledger, the betrayal, or the realization that even victory left questions unanswered. But I knew this. The case of the letter that arrived after his death was more than just a test of Holmes's logic. It had tested his conscience, and maybe, just this once, that was the bigger mystery he had to solve.